Welcome back to the Talented Learning Show podcast series, episode 42, with independent learning tech analyst John Lay. Today I interview Barry Kelly, CEO of Thought Industries, about the current state of customer learning in 2021. Find more of our content at talentedlearning.com. Well, welcome back, listeners, to the Talented Learning Show podcast series. On this show, I'm fortunate to interview the world's leading experts in extended enterprise learning solutions from both the vendor and the practitioner perspectives. Extended enterprise being defined as any educational activity that's targeted to your non-employee audiences, such as customers, prospects, and partners, resellers, members, and more. And today is no different, as we have Barry Kelly, CEO of Thought Industries, back with us a second time here on the show in the last few years. Thought Industries being one of the world's premier customer learning software solution organizations. And so we're going to get an update of what's going on in the industry, find out what's hot, what's trending, how COVID's impacted it, and more. Barry, welcome to the Talented Learning Show.
Great to be here. Thanks, John. Always great to join you.
Oh, it's great to have you as one of the visionaries here in customer learning and one of the first experts I met that is dedicating themselves all the way back when I started Talented Learning almost 8 years ago. We met and have been sharing resources and best practices on customer learning and extended enterprise learning in general. So it's always great to get your perspective on this. But for those that haven't met you before or haven't listened to the previous time you were on the podcast or one of our webinars, could you give us a minute or two quickly on Thought Industries and your role in the marketplace?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. We founded Thought Industries, coming up on about 8 years ago now. We are an enterprise learning technology company that focuses exclusively on external learning, and that basically means that our technology is used and leveraged in customer education, customer training, educational services, and then we provide technologies for organizations that have a core training as a product. So enterprise training companies, professional continuing education associations, any organizations that are trying to manage and deliver, the business of learning. And, we are headquartered in Boston, but we've got employees spread out all over the United States and in Ireland. And, it's been a great ride for the last 8 years. And, I think so excited about where the market is continuing to go. So looking forward to digging into all this today.
All right. And you more than anybody knows where the market is going, because for the third or fourth year in a row now, you being Thought Industries as an organization, has published the State of the Customer Education Report, and you've done so again for 2021. And so I was wondering, before we dig into what the results were, could you tell us about the report, the purpose, and the process of how you get this data real quick to set the stage?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. We, with this, as we said, this is in our 2021, I think is our third year that we've issued a report. I think we wanted to get inside the feedback, I suppose, inside the organizations that are delivering, customer education, across the globe. Understand a lot of the nuances in the market. What departments are they reporting into? What are they leveraging customer education for? How are they measuring it? What sort of impact is it having on their business? And then other nuances in terms of the types of modalities of learning that are being delivered. So, it's remained, the questions that we ask remain consistent across the board. We're able to look at the delta between, the data points kind of year over year. But it's just been a fascinating way to get that, market feedback in terms of the things that are working, and maybe some of the things that aren't working so well too.
Interesting. So you ask the same questions each year, and then that gives you basically the year over year. That's what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some, I think there's a core series of questions that are really, that are repeat year over year. And then, depending on what's happening, obviously we had questions this year related to COVID-19 and the effects of the pandemic on learning and customer education. So, those were factored in. And then, you start to see trends in the market. We introduce questioning around that as well. So. Wow.
And what were the top insights? I know you can't summarize a whole big report in 2 seconds, but if you can narrow it down to the top 2 or 3 things that you thought really stood out this year in comparison to the other 2 years.
Absolutely.
What would they be?
Yeah, I think, I think the great thing is that, customer education continues to grow. I think over 60% of those that we surveyed in the report, have increased their, investment in customer education well over 30%. So we're still continuing to see growth. I think, we obviously have seen changes and upticks in sort of monetization. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And also, one of the other data points that's pretty interesting, that's actually consistent over last year at 43% of the audience struggling to measure the impact of customer education effectively. And that's something that we've heard, over and over again, and something that, we continue to kind of dig in on and try and understand why. And I think we'll get into this maybe a little bit later on in the conversation, but, I think it's how traditional learning platforms or learning technologies have measured the impact of learning. And I think for customer education, it's slightly different because the impact of learning is found, in other parts of the business, whether it's retention or, customer CSAT, NPS, lots of other, product engagement, things like that, which we'll chat about. But, pretty interesting that people are still struggling with the measurement.
That is really interesting because I say how easy it is all the time. So maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, maybe. I think, it's interesting. There's sort of, I think there's a sort of a maturity scale, and I think people have talked a lot about the sort of maturity model around customer education. And I think as the organization changes, the needs on how we report and customers have impact on the business kind of change. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I certainly think, depending on your stage of maturity, there's different ways to look at the impact of the technology or the impact of the educational programs. I think the one thing is that, a lot of those data points are spread out across a lot of different adjacent technologies and platforms. So CRM systems, product adoption systems, support technology, community technologies, all of the sort of marketing or post-sale customer stack that organizations are used. So in a lot of cases, the impact of customer education, the data points from that and the KPIs are actually housed in other technologies. And so that's why I think some organizations are finding it a little bit tricky to kind of trace back, exactly how, some of the programs are impacting the learners. I mean, there's the default, components of measurement that are embedded in any learning management system, assessments and progress and starts, finishes, and, all these other things that are associated with that. But, really, if you've got to get in and figure out if the customer is having success, that information tends to be elsewhere.
That's a really interesting point because all those systems, those ancillary systems that house the evidence of the measurable result, are all systems that are not integrated typically with an employee LMS.
Yeah.
So if you have an employee LMS and you're expanding that out, learning system to those external audiences, all of those are new systems you have to learn about and understand and figure out how to integrate with and understand those KPIs. And all of that would be, a new set of knowledge, for all of those. And, that's probably one, but I would think that the message must be getting through, because if we have, such an increase in, the adoption and the spending, why do you think that has risen that 30%, here recently? What's the cause of that acceleration?
Yeah, I think there's some really important macro business, trends that have been happening over a long number of years. I mean, there's a focus on the customer like never before. The subscription economy, it relies on, retaining a customer, year over year, and the value of that customer is critical to the success of the business. Now, we're talking a little bit about the SaaS model as in terms of sort of software learning, but we're seeing a lot of those behaviors across, lifetime value that are being adapted and adopted by other organizations that may have physical product or different delivery models. But the customer has become, the sort of epicenter of everything that's important to the organization. And I think part of it is that, we've seen that through, the customer success movement, which has been growing over the last 8 years in terms of how technologies and strategies around how to optimize the relationship with the customer at different stages of that life cycle. But I think, I think organizations are realizing that, learning and educating the customer is such a critical part of that movement. And I think we're starting to see that growth. The interesting thing is that the customer is in a sort of constant state of evolution, right? It's not a static journey. So they go from like unaware to aware to a prospect to a trialer to a new customer to an adopting customer. And then, hopefully, they become an advocate or a neutral or a detractor, right? So there's constant sort of change and metamorphosis of the customer, and it's a journey of education and learning, right? It's about understanding the concepts, about understanding how to have success with a product, about innovating around a product, and their needs are very different at different stages along the way. So I think that's why we're seeing it. I think organizations are realizing that, whereas before maybe L&D was a function that serves and focused mostly on the internal employee, they're realizing the benefits of actually educating the market now and educating the customer. So it's a fascinating time. I think that individuals that have had careers in learning and development are starting to find themselves maybe even sitting in the marketing group, which is interesting too.
They never would have thought they'd be instructional marketers when they started their career back in their master's degree in instructional design. So tell me, you're describing, without using the words, you're describing the customer life cycle of all the way from unaware to advocate and every stage in between. And many organizations find initial value in the onboarding phase, because it's one of the easier ones to measure of bringing a customer up. But you mentioned, 8 different phases that are outside the onboarding phase. Are strategic organizations now targeting all 8 of those different phases, or some of them more than others? What are your thoughts on that? It seems like there's a lot of value by looking at it that way.
Yeah, tons of value. So I would say, the research, has been sort of consistent year over year. I think in our report, I'm hopefully my memory serves me correctly here, but I think about 62% surveyed said that their focus was really on onboarding and retention. And then I think, and so I think that was the main area of focus. And we see that. I think the entry point into customer education and the need, usually starts there. It starts in onboarding. I need a better way to get time to value here. We're getting scale. We're onboarding customers every day. We're onboarding new customers, but we're also onboarding new users in customer accounts. So that sort of process, that never goes away. In fact, it gets more demanding. So I think that's the initial area where organizations focus, get that right, and then they can begin to look at, the other stages of the life cycle as well. And those, get around product adoption, product mastery certification, channels, partners, all of the other things, how to, certified the trainers, certifying the markets, the resellers. But I think, ultimately organizations that maybe have a complex product or trying to define a new segment in the market really look at educating the market as a really critical component of their go-to-market strategy. And again, best practices, thought leadership, those things are really critical, for organizations that are trying to help the market understand how to use their products and why, a particular practice is important to a business. So it's exciting to see that. It's a different type of learning. It's a different type of delivery object. It's definitely a collaboration with marketing. I mean, there's a term used called the EQL, the Education Qualified Lead, right? Which is exactly, a marketing qualified lead, right? Same thing, only it's qualified through, educational programs that have been released to the market. And we've talked about this before, but there's been companies over the years that have done a phenomenal job of this, the likes of HubSpot, where there's a whole ton of people who are inbound certified. I mean, it's a pretty beautiful example of that, sort of market education at work.
And really getting them to that advocate phase. You know, if you're
Yeah.
getting yourself, now you're certified and now you're putting it on your LinkedIn profile as a way to, you know, to get a new job and stuff.
Yeah.
What a great way to be onboarding. You know, it's, you know, as you talk about the different phases and the life cycle and the places of value, you know, it's hard to think about, you know, just if you are focused on employee learning solely and you expand out the customer, I don't think that you realize that, you know, how much there is out there.
Yeah.
It's as much as developing an employee, but actually much more when you think about the different stages. And so I've seen organizations now really adopting a individual team or a dedicated team that may interact with the HR and training team, but a dedicated team that's focused on the customer learning life cycle and the application of training. Are you seeing that also, or do you see it being driven more by HR?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see more groups. Like our organization internally, the Learning Strategies Group, oversees all of our training. So across everything inside our company, whether internal employees, sales organization, as well as you know, our customer education. And I think it provides a lot of consistency, right? So there's a way to understand, you know, what content or what particular strategies are going to be beneficial for the customer and for the employee, and especially the customer-facing groups. It's you know, it'd be interesting. I think it's kind of counterintuitive to be training, like, you know, your customer success team from your internal L&D team, and then, you know, be training your customer with a completely different team.
Yeah.
You know, without actually having a lot of collaboration there. So I think there's huge benefits of bringing everybody together. You know, I think we're seeing a little bit more of that at the organization. We're also, quite frankly, seeing, you know, the customer education group move around inside organizations.
How so?
You know, just, you know, reporting into customer success, reporting into marketing, reporting into the services team, you know, especially in education services where they might report into COO, operations. You know, and we've worked with organizations that have moved, you know, kind of midstream, you know, where it's maybe moved from marketing back to customer success and vice versa. So, you know, I think over time, you know, and then depending on the life stage of the organization, you know, we'll start to see some consolidation or consistency in where those departments live. But you know, I think we'd all love to see a centralized learning organization that is thinking about everybody and everything in one sort of seamless movement. So yeah, it's interesting.
So how has COVID impacted the industry? Has it made a difference in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, I would say for us, you know, we've always been very focused, you know, on the external learner and on organizations that, you know, are, we can be a good partner to. I think that's an important thing to do. You got to know, you know, when there's a good fit. And I do feel like at the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of noise in the market, just in terms of, you know, organizations being forced or forced into buying technology for the first time without having a lot of, you know, experience or having a really clear understanding of what they wanted to do strategically. And so, you know, I think that can be a little risky, right? Definitely a lot of volume, a lot of opportunity, but you have to be very careful that you can help organizations kind of fulfill on their goals. So we focused heavily to make sure that we were able to, you know, we still were focused on our ideal customer because we want consistency in our roadmap. We want to be able to provide a consistent experience and value. But I think, you know, if we look at it, I think it's had a big impact, and I think our report had mentioned, I think it was 41% prioritized from in-person to virtual learning. And 77% said the pandemic made customer education, increased the importance of customer education at the organization. So that's a really big data point. But I'll say this, I think, you know, we're big fans. We started the company of, you know, crossing the chasm. And, you know, when you start to do something, you know, in many ways that's brand new and a new segment, it's really important to find those early adopters, those visionaries. And I think in the different stages, for the last 7 years, we'd have individuals, I would say, that are early adopters that have been moving, taking sort of the in-person delivery model and starting to diversify it. And they've been doing that over time. And I would say, and it's not as still an early adopter market. In fact, I would say like that, the pragmatists, so that sort of first stage past the chasm, right, that those organizations have been slowly adopting over time, getting prepared. But I think in March last year, this accelerant, through the pandemic hit the market, and everybody overnight had to figure out how to move from this in-person model to a more blended model, or even just virtualize as a step one. And so, I would say that in many ways, these like the late majority individuals in that model are like, we're just forced to adapt. And as a result, I think that we're just going to have pretty wide stream change in the way that individuals learn going forward. I don't think we're going to go back and you're going to see the same volume of in-person training as was there before. I think the individuals themselves know they have better, should have better options, better product experiences, that they can learn just as much virtually or in a blended model. So again, I think it's, COVID-19 has been, a sort of an accelerant for the market in terms of organizations really thinking ahead about, what's the delivery model. And I think that's a really good thing.
I think so too. I think so too. So you and I have done one or two webinars over the years as time has evolved around customer learning and monetization strategies in general. Do you charge for it? Do you not charge for it? Why? How has that shifted in I know that's a big question, but any current trends on how organizations are looking at monetization of this?
Yeah. It's a tricky one. I don't know if there's a definitive, answer or this kind of obvious point. I think it all comes down to a lot of times to the life stage of the organization in its maturity model, when to kind of move from maybe, to make that change or the transition from cross center to profit center. I think there's organizations that are education customers that may be educational services organizations that, have P&Ls, right? And who are, have been selling learning for a long time and will consistently do it over long periods of time. And that's a critical part of their business. And then I think there's other organizations that really the focus of customer education is really to impact retention, customer satisfaction, time to value, and charging for and monetizing education isn't important to the organization. All of the effort has to go into the focus on the customer being retained, or expanding that ACV. So I think it really comes down to, the goal of the organization. My advice to any organization thinking about it is like, make sure that your customer education program is just aligned with what's happening in the boardroom. Like what are the current KPIs? What are the goals for the company for the year, for the next 2 years? How are you plugged into that? And if monetization is an important part of that, then great. And I think there is, people will say that we hear a lot of conversations about having to ask for budget every year, right? The customer education department, I want more budget. I want more people. I want to expand programs. And maybe the executive teams are like, why? And so I think there's an option from some organizations to begin to, generate revenue, whether it's onboarding training or re-onboarding or, other niche focused programs where you can begin to generate revenue that might help support your internal growth. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I think in our data, 43% of the people surveyed are monetizing, with 22% saying they're planning to do it this year. So it'll be interesting to get a closer look at, what some of those tipping points were for those organizations to move there.
Well, how interesting. It's easy not easy, as we talked about earlier, but easy-ish to show the impact on the business, from training to increase in sales or increase in renewal or decrease in customer satisfaction. But then to see the secondary way, so you ask for budget and you have that advantage and say, look at the impact. but then you could just make it just all that easier by starting to figure out what these other trickles of revenue, could be in, from a revenue standpoint that are adjacent to that is kind of a brilliant way of looking how you can step into it. Your report, though, said that only 6% of respondents thought that their audiences were receiving enough training. So there's a couple of ways to look at that. One way to look at that is, yuck, that's terrible. The other way is, wow, there's 94% upside here.
Yeah.
What's driving that stat, you think? Why is that
I love
so
the way
hard?
you look at it. Is that glass half full? I think that's what that is, John. Yeah. 94% upside. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I would say, so maybe I'll answer the question in a kind of an upside down way for a second. I think if you think about just all the things we talked about, the strategies around educating the customer and how important they are, and you think about all products, right? Think about, we tend to just focus on B2B. So any physical product organization or software company with a B2B product that needs to educate their customer at anywhere in the life cycle, that's kind of where the focus is. And you have to think about the context, the sort of traditional learning format is disappearing, right? The sort of location of the LMS is kind of beginning to disintegrate, and this whole concept that we've talked about for a long, the moment of need, meeting the customer where they are, this is absolutely critical in the way that individuals need to be, educated in the life cycle. So, and it's about awareness, right? So the only way you might know about training in that 6% is maybe you've seen a link somewhere in the software, or maybe you got an email that you found as you were just checking out your spam folder on a Friday to make sure you didn't miss anything critical, and you found a coupon code to go learn.
Probably right next to my email.
Yes, exactly. No, yours is in the inbox, getting delivered. Sure of that. But so I think, I think the access point to the customer, is difficult, right? I think it's difficult in the traditional models, and I think we need to turn that on its head and say, I need to just, my eyeball needs to go to the right, and I need to be able to gain access to learning. And I think we think about it, in order to change that 6%, what we need to do is we need to think about education in the context of an individual's job or the job that they're trying to get done. So if I'm looking for help, right, the support journey, we're looking at ways ourselves. We actually have a little project going off here next week, actually on Thursday, to start looking at support, training in the process of support deflection. So when someone wants to be helped, how are we helping them? Are we asking them to just go submit a ticket, or are we actually seeing if there's a way for us to change their behavior, help them learn? We got to think about that. We got to think about where they are in the context of the product. Are they out in the field installing HVAC and they need to figure out how some condenser needs to work? Are they in a software application trying to execute a task, download a report? Where are they? And do we need to provide guidance to have them, remove a blocker, or do we actually need to train them to be able to get, success from the product? So we have to think much more universally about where the customer is, the task that they're trying to execute, where they're doing this, and the context they're doing it. And I think if we do that, we have a much better chance of increasing that 6%, that 94% upside is there, because embedded in that 6% is a link to your LMS, that you can't find anywhere.
Wow, who would have thought audience analysis, adaptive and personalized learning, learning in the flow of work would be important here outside of employee learning, huh? That's like the identical topics everybody's worried about, but worried about it focusing out. So we're out of time. Fascinating conversation. You gave us a great piece of advice about aligning the program with what's in the boardroom.
Yeah.
Let me get more specific on one last piece of advice. So say you're an organization that's just really not doing this right, and you're in training HR. What would be your advice to that person on what would be their first steps to think about how they could reach out and start supporting customer learning? What would you do in their shoes as a first step to get the ball rolling in an organization that's just hasn't got started yet? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I think starting with the teams that are, facing the customer, initially, right? I think you either, sales enablement organizations or internal training have the responsibility to train the support organization, the customer success organization, potentially some of the go-to-market teams. So that's the first place to start, because I think there's a lot of alignment between the type of information that that you're sharing, and the behavior that you're trying to behavior change that you're trying to impart. So I think kind of starting there a little bit. I think also I think a general sense of curiosity with the marketing organization, understanding the market. I think there's a huge benefit from an organization internally, and again, there's a lot of internal training happens in many organizations, and we all start with compliance and all the other things that are important, and leadership management and manager training. But really helping the organization truly understand the market, understand the customer. Like we talk about, walking in the shoes of the customer in our internal company. Could everybody at our company land the plane if they had to go and be a temp at a customer education department tomorrow? So I think from an internally focused L&D team, it's making sure that as you look at the curriculum, and you look at how that's being delivered, how is that, how can that also be shared and delivered to the sort of customers themselves? So I think that's an just a place to start. Obviously, there's lots of other things and other places to go there, but I think that would be my advice to begin with.
Now, there you have it. Sage advice. Barry Kelly, CEO at Thought Industries. Fascinating conversation as always. You always give such an interesting perspective on how to think about customer learning. It's even here at Talented Learning, we continue to grow and think about new shades and new reflections of this. But even in our own estimation, we typically think of the life cycle as four, and so of four different stages. And so in this conversation, I'm already, thinking, wow, I'm not doing it justice. It's even broader than that. And that's just one example of just the insights that you bring every single time you join us here at Talented Learning. So thanks so much for carving out the time. Great to speak with you again.
My pleasure, John. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for everything you do, and for keeping us all informed in this market. And it's been great to be part of it over the last 8 years. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Outstanding. Keep leading away. Barry, we'll have you back on soon to give us the next update. 22 will be here before we know it. Audience, thanks for listening to another episode of the Talented Learning Show. You can find more of our free content at talentedlearning.com. Have a great day, everyone.